The wind had been screaming through the Cascade foothills for 3 days straight when Elsie Munro made the decision that would either save her son's life or end both of theirs. Her boy, Thomas, 7 years old and burning with a fever that wouldn't break, had grown too weak to walk on his own, and the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away through snow that had already swallowed the trail twice that winter. Their cabin, a mile back down the mountain, had lost half its roof to the last storm, and the woodpile she'd counted on to keep them through the season had been reduced to nothing but wet, useless logs. She'd heard the old-timers in town talk about a cave system cut into the mountainside above the tree line, a place trappers had used a generation ago, and though she'd never gone near it herself, desperation had a way of making strangers of familiar fears. So she'd wrapped Thomas in every blanket she owned, strapped him to her back with a length of rope, taken up her husband's old sledgehammer and a canvas sack of what little food remained, and started climbing. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead 11 months now, thrown from his horse during a summer storm and never waking from the fall, and in the time since, Elsie had learned more about survival than she'd ever wanted to know. She'd learned to fell trees, to skin game, to mend fences with numb fingers in January, to swallow her fear before her son could see it on her face. But nothing had prepared her for the particular terror of watching Thomas grow paler and quieter with each passing hour, his small body shaking against her back as she trudged upward through drifts that reached her knees. The dog, Biscuit, a scrappy terrier mix Daniel had rescued from a trapline years before, trotting close at her heels as if he understood the weight of what they were doing. She found the cave entrance just before dusk, a dark gash in the granite half hidden behind a fall of boulders, exactly where old Mr. Abernathy at the trading post had described it. The wind dropped the moment she stepped inside, the silence so sudden and complete it made her ears ring, and by the light of the single match she dared to strike, she saw that the cave went back farther than she'd expected, the stone walls smooth in places as if water had carved them over centuries. She went as deep as she trusted herself to go without more light, found a shelf of dry rock protected from any draft, and laid Thomas down there, tucking every blanket around him she could spare. His breathing was shallow and fast, and when she pressed her lips to his forehead, the heat of him frightened her more than the cold outside ever could. She built what fire she could from the kindling she'd carried up in her pack, a small, sad flame that did little more than hold back the absolute dark, and she sat beside her son through that first night with a sledgehammer across her knees, not because she expected to need it as a weapon, but because its weight was the only thing in that black, echoing cave that felt solid and real. Biscuit curled against Thomas's side, and somewhere in the deepest hours of the night, Elsie realized the dog had stopped shivering, that his fur had gone warm rather than cold, and that the stone at her son's back seemed less like an enemy and more like something holding a memory of heat. She told herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her. That stone couldn't hold warmth in a mountain that hadn't seen a summer sun break through in months, but she noticed it again the second night, and the third, and by then, curiosity had begun to war with her grief and her fear in equal measure. On the fourth day, with Thomas's fever finally beginning, agonizingly slowly, to break, Elsie ventured farther into the cave than she had before, following the source of that strange, persistent warmth. She found it at a narrow seam in the rock, a place where the stone wall sounded different when she rapped her knuckles against it. Hollow in a way solid granite had no business sounding. She pressed her ear to the seam and heard, or thought she heard, the faintest suggestion of movement on the other side, air shifting somewhere beyond the rock. It might have been nothing. It might have been the wind finding some other opening deeper in the mountain. But warmth didn't lie, not in a place this cold, and warmth meant something on the other side of that wall was different from the frozen wilderness she and her son had climbed into. She thought of Daniel then, of the stories his grandfather used to tell about the old mountain folk, families who'd carved homes directly into the rock during the hardest winters of the last century, when the passes closed for months at a time, and a man either found shelter in the mountain itself or didn't survive to see spring. She'd always taken the stories for exaggeration, the kind of tall tale men told around a fire to make a hard land sound more mysterious than it was. But hunger and desperation had taught her, over these long widowed months, that most old stories carried a kernel of truth buried somewhere inside the exaggeration, the way a seed sat buried inside a husk. Thomas's fever broke fully on the 5th morning, and though he was weak and thin and needed real food and real warmth more than she could provide in that half-frozen cave, he was, for the first time in a week, going to live. That certainty gave Elsie something she hadn't had in longer than she could remember. The strength to hope for more than mere survival. She left Thomas wrapped warm with Biscuit curled protectively against him, took up the sledgehammer, and returned to the seam in the rock. She told herself she was testing a theory, nothing more, that if there was truly a warmer space beyond that wall, it might mean a better place to shelter until the boy was strong enough to travel, or even a passage that led somewhere safer than the mountain's exposed flank. She swung the hammer for the first time with more hope than force, and the sound of stone cracking echoed through the cave like a gunshot, startling a flurry of unseen bats from somewhere deeper in the dark. It took her the better part of that day and into the next, swinging until her shoulders screamed and her palms split and bled inside her gloves, resting only when her arm shook too badly to lift the hammer another time. But slowly, stone by stubborn stone, the seam widened into a gap, and the gap into an opening, and through that opening came air that was, unmistakably, warmer than anything the cave had offered, carrying with it the faint, impossible scent of wood smoke. Elsie stood frozen at the threshold of what she'd uncovered, her breath catching somewhere between terror and disbelief, because what lay beyond that broken wall was not another cold chamber of raw stone, but a room, a proper room, hewn and shaped by human hands generations past, with a small iron stove still standing cold and rusted but intact in one corner, wooden shelves along the walls holding jars gone dark with age, and against the far wall, a bed frame draped in what remained of furs so old they'd stiffened into something closer to leather. She called Thomas's name before she even understood why, some instinct telling her that whatever she'd found needed to be shared with him immediately, that this discovery belonged to both of them equally after everything they'd survived to reach it. He came stumbling to her side, wrapped in blankets, Biscuit trotting ahead of him with his nose already lifted to the strange new scents drifting from the hidden chamber, and together, mother and son and dog stood at the broken threshold and stared into a home that had been sealed inside the mountain, waiting, for longer than either of them could guess. It took Elsie 3 more days of careful exploration to understand what she'd found. The chamber, and the smaller rooms that branched from it, had clearly belonged to a family, trappers or hermits or perhaps refugees from some hardship lost now to time, who had carved out an existence entirely within the mountain's stone belly. The old stove, once she'd cleared its flue of decades of nesting debris and coaxed a fire to life within it, drew smoke up through a natural chimney of rock that must have vented somewhere on the mountainside far above, explaining the warmth she'd sensed bleeding through the seam. The jars on the shelves, though the contents of most had long since spoiled, revealed careful, patient hands that had once preserved fruit and meat and vegetables against long winters, and in a chest near the bed, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow kept the damp at bay, she found tools, a Bible with names and dates inked into its front pages going back 60 years, and a child's carved wooden toy, a small dog remarkably like Biscuit, worn smooth by hands that had loved it. She realized, reading those names by lamplight while Thomas slept warm and improving in the bed that had once belonged to some other mountain family's child, that whoever had lived here had vanished from the historical record entirely, their carved-out home forgotten by everyone except the mountain itself, sealed behind a wall of stone for reasons she would never fully know, whether by their own choice to seal themselves in against some threat, or by a rock slide that had trapped the entrance, long after they'd already moved on, or by something sadder that she chose, in the end, not to dwell upon. What mattered to her, in that moment, was not the mystery of who had come before, but the simple, staggering fact that this place, this warm, sheltered, forgotten room inside the mountain, had been exactly what she and her son needed, waiting for them at precisely the moment their need was greatest, as if the mountain itself had kept it in trust across all those silent decades for the day someone would need it again. She stayed through the rest of that winter, unwilling to risk the mountain trails with Thomas still recovering his strength, and in the weeks that followed she cleared the old chimney fully, repaired what could be repaired, and turned the forgotten chamber into something livable again, hauling what supplies she could manage from the ruined cabin below whenever the weather allowed a safe descent. Thomas grew stronger by the day, color returning to his cheeks, his laughter returning to the stone chambers for the first time in generations, chasing Biscuit through passages that had known nothing but silence and dark for longer than either of them could imagine. Elsie found herself, in the quiet hours after Thomas had fallen asleep, running her fingers over the names inked into that old Bible, wondering about the mother who had once kept this home, who had once, perhaps, faced her own version of the desperate climb Elsie had made, and she felt less alone in the mountain's belly than she had felt in 11 long months of grieving in a cabin too big and too empty for a widow and her son. When spring finally broke the mountain's grip and the trails opened enough to risk the journey down to town, Elsie didn't tell anyone at first about what she'd found, some protective instinct keeping the discovery close, a secret shared only between herself, her son, and a dog who seemed, in his own way, to understand exactly how much that hidden room had mattered. But word traveled eventually, as it always did in small mountain towns. Once a trapper stumbled across the widened cave entrance and reported strange signs of habitation to the sheriff, and Elsie found herself, that summer, sitting across from old Mr. Abernathy at the trading post, telling him the whole impossible story while he listened with his pipe forgotten and cooling in his hand. He was the one who finally gave her an answer to the mystery, digging through boxes of county records that had sat forgotten in the trading post's back room for decades, and he found, eventually, a brief mention in an old ledger of a family named Halloway, trappers who had settled the mountain nearly 60 years before Elsie's own arrival, and who had simply stopped appearing in town one autumn, their disappearance noted with a few terse lines and never fully investigated, the assumption at the time being that they'd moved on to easier country rather than face another hard winter. No one had ever known they'd sealed themselves into the mountainside instead, whether by choice or by circumstance the old records couldn't say, and no one had ever known, until Elsie's desperate climb with a sick child on her back, that a piece of that vanished family had been waiting inside the stone all along. Elsie made the mountain chamber her permanent home after that, unwilling to abandon a place that had saved her son's life for the uncertain comfort of rebuilding a cabin that held only memories of hardship and loss. She restored what she could of the old Halloway rooms, added chambers of her own carved with the help of hired hands from town once word of her strange good fortune brought curious, sympathetic neighbors to her door, and by the time Thomas turned 10, the mountain home had become something of a local legend, a place travelers sometimes asked to see, though Elsie kept her door closed to all but the few she trusted, protective of the sanctuary that had given her and her son a second chance at a life she'd once feared was ending in that cold, wind-battered cave. Years later, when Thomas was grown and had children of his own scrambling through those same stone passages, Elsie would sometimes sit by the old iron stove in the evenings, the same stove she'd coaxed back to life with frozen, bleeding hands during the worst week of her life, and she would think about the strange, quiet mercy of a mountain that had kept a stranger's home safe and warm for 60 forgotten years, waiting, as if it had known all along, for a desperate mother and her dying son to come climbing through the snow and find it. She never did learn what had truly become of the Halloway family, whether they'd perished within these very walls or found some other fate beyond them, but she chose, always, to believe they would have wanted exactly this, wanted their hidden home to hold warmth and laughter again rather than sit forever empty and forgotten in the dark, and on quiet winter nights, with the wind screaming outside just as it had on the night she'd first climbed this mountain with nothing left to lose. Elsie Munro would press her palm flat against the old stone wall and feel, or imagine she felt, something like gratitude passing back to her through 60 years of patient, waiting silence, a mountain's quiet promise that no true shelter, once given, is ever entirely lost.